Hi everybody, my name is Tim Warren, and today I'll be doing a presentation on a Bayesian multivariate linear regression on the effects of wealth on well-being. And I used three research questions, the first being, how does wealth affect one's physical health, happiness, and life satisfaction? And physical health, happiness, and life satisfaction are the response variables that I'm using as a gauge of well-being in the individuals that responded to the survey. And wealth is going to be the explanatory variable in this research, and we're going to go over what that encompasses in a little bit. And the second question I had is there a trade-off between any of the response variables? And for example, that would be to say, if an increase in wealth was found to increase one's physical health, but decrease their happiness, right? Is there a trade-off between wealth and physical health, happiness, and life satisfaction in which one is increased and another is decreased? And the third question is, does the data conform to societal preconceptions of the effects of wealth? And that is in conforming to American and more generally Western conceptions of wealth, and that being that wealth is a gauge of happiness, satisfaction in life, and how successful you are. And I wanted to figure out if wealth was truly a gauge of one's personal well-being, as we've seen many graphs and research indicate that it may be the case, as the one that's displayed right here. And the data comes from the GSS Social Survey, and it is the most widely used social science data set in the United States, being used in nearly 32,000 publications. And it is conducted biannually since 1972. And what happens when respondents are chosen is they are randomly selected from households across the United States from publicly available addresses, and one individual from that household is going to take the survey for the entire house and just going to be their response. And for the theory behind this research, first we're going to talk about the Easterland paradox, which is the research that you'll find in a lot of papers discussing how wealth affects one's well-being. And that is that at a point in time, your happiness may vary directly with your income, but over the long term, you're going to return to that steady state of happiness, and it's not going to affect your overall long-term well-being. So that is something to consider when taking a view at this research, and also the data set as that is being asked at a particular point in that person's life. And additionally, we're going to look at the hedonic treadmill, which states that individuals are going to return to base happiness, even as social comparison and wealth provides temporary well-being. And so that is going to be a gauge of how individuals are reacting to their peers over the long term rather than just short-term changes. And something that really interested me was that we found that latest research has found happiness and life satisfaction are associated with relative income, but negative emotion is associated with relative income and absolute income. That is to say that your relative income, say across your peers or in the area that you're living in, can either increase or decrease your happiness. But your absolute income, say something such as your net wealth, that is only associated with negative emotions. And we've also seen that social comparison is very, very important in driving happiness when it comes to wealth. And we've seen that without social comparison, this, wealth may not even be a gauge of one's happiness and well-being. So that's another thing to consider going into this research. Additionally, we've seen that the highest absolute and relative wealth is correlated with the healthiest groups, whether or not that is for the United States or nations across the globe. And that makes sense as those individuals are best able to afford the best healthcare, medicines, best food, and are able to have things such as regular physician checks and even preventive care. And this even extends to whole families, as individuals who are caring for children who are low income will affect their children and the lifestyles that they're able to do. And you see this interesting graph right here talking about life satisfaction with income distribution. And we see the incredibly significant positive correlation between wealth and life satisfaction. And furthermore, going on the research and why I personally wanted to go over this was that we've seen that in previous research, we're only really focusing on income and wealth, but we're not controlling for financial satisfaction. And I think that this is incredibly important, as financial satisfaction has a lot to do with whether one's moral values align with the achievement of more wealth. And that's something to consider when someone is thinking about their entire life and their goals for health and happiness, is your financial satisfaction is going to be a gauge of how you're able to achieve those things. And that's why I believe it's important to study this. And we've also seen that none of these have measured this with the use of a Bayesian multivariate linear regression. And the reason why I am doing it is because that we can use these societal preconceptions in our priors and then update them with this data to get to our posterior, which is then going to be an influence of both the data and also societal preconceptions and norms that is going to come together and form my research here in this presentation. Now, my explanatory variables are income, wealth, and financial satisfaction, and these are all fairly self-explanatory. Income was divided into high, medium, and low, the lowest being the poverty guideline for an individual in a household of just one person, so that is below $10,000. And I gauge the high as the highest available data set within income was 25,000 or above, so that's what I limited as the highest. Wealth, I based it off the US News and World Report and separated the data into quintiles. And financial satisfaction was very easy to satisfy. It was just, are you pretty well satisfied, more or less satisfied, or not satisfied at all with your wealth? And I assign numerical values to the response variables. So this will help us in the overall Bayesian multivariate linear regression process, as this is somewhat necessary when you're looking at categorical variables such as life satisfaction, health, and happiness. And these, again, these questions are very self-explanatory and very simple to answer. And so the code and method that I used the same model string, the same data, and the same posterior throughout all three of the calculations that I did. The only thing that changed across the three different runs that I did was which response variables I used, right? Did I use life satisfaction, health, or happiness? And so we see with the first results with this code, these are the results for happiness. And we found that individuals that had the highest income, were upper middle class, and pretty well satisfied, tended to be the most happy. And you can see in the summarization down below that there are some interesting things to note in this data. Number one, you'll see in wealth that the wealthiest class and the upper middle class don't necessarily have two distinctive betas from one another. And so that is important in gauging whether or not this is just an upper middle class or a wealthier class uh, phenomenon in general. And we see that it seems to be that the top 40% of net worth seem to have fairly similar betas regarding happiness. But we see that with the other betas for the other distinctions, such as wealth and for such as financial satisfaction and income, are pretty separate from one another. And we see that none of the betas are truly very similar to each other, especially regarding the medians. And so going on this, we saw that happiness is significantly positively correlated with wealth. And that really goes along with cultural norms. But the thing that we must consider is that this is contrasting previous research that I just mentioned that states that isolated absolute wealth should have no effect on income. But as we clearly see in this, the individual's net wealth, which is when you think of net worth, that is your assets minus your liabilities, that is a gauge of one's happiness. And so this does go against what prior research is saying. And so we are led to believe by these results that absolute wealth may in fact be an indicator of positive happiness. And so going on to our results from health, we saw that the largest betas were for high income, upper middle class, and pretty well satisfied. This is basically the exact same as the happiness one. And we saw that the betas were a little bit more separated with this one, and that for health, even though health has the same 10, 20, 30 layout of happiness, the betas for the income, wealth, and financial satisfaction were very separated. And that being said, we also see that the wealthiest class also has a fairly similar beta to upper middle class, but it is not as similar as it was for happiness. And we see that this really makes sense with a lot of theory and recent research that the wealthiest, highest income individuals are going to have the best health. And when we think about this intuitively, as I just stated previously, these individuals can afford the best healthcare, which we know is a priority in the United States, in which case healthcare is not available for all individuals across the income spectrum. And especially regarding healthcare insurance, there are many jobs, especially those that are low paying, that do not offer great healthcare. And so this is especially a disadvantage for those who are in low income. And this is one of the ones that I really wanted to stress in going forward and talking about in regards to policy implications. Now, the results on life satisfaction I thought were also very interesting. So we saw that the highest betas were for high income, the wealthiest class, and the pretty well satisfied. But we also see that the wealthiest and the upper middle class didn't have very distinctive betas, which has been a pattern throughout this entire research. The upper 40 percentile of wealth tends to not differ too much in terms of the betas, but the betas beneath them are fairly different. And another thing that is of note in this research that is across all of the three is that we see that although there is significant fragmentation among all five quintiles of wealth, we notice that the lower middle class happens to have a higher beta for health and for life satisfaction than the middle class and the poorest class, which is something that I thought was very interesting in looking at this and didn't really seem to have an intuitive explanation. But other than that, the results for life satisfaction were fairly straightforward. That being said, we see that this disagrees with contemporary research that states that absolute wealth has no effect on life satisfaction. As we clearly state here that, and we see that the wealth actually does have a pretty important impact on life satisfaction, although we do see that this differs substantially from things such as wealth, income, and financial satisfaction. And when we look at the implications of these results, we found that in going across the three different measures of well-being, that the individuals with the highest income, top 40% of net worth, and those with the greatest financial satisfaction tend to have the best well-being. Now, limitations to this research are obviously plenty, and the one being that the cultural norms regarding wealth have been actualized is that there are other aspects of well-being that may not have been actualized in this research. But one of the things that I wanted to focus on, particularly in coming away from this research, was the public policy implications that are necessary. Because we see that there's such a difference in well being across individuals of all different incomes, it's especially important that we can equalize this field so that well being is not attributable just to income and just to wealth, as that is truly unfair to really society as a whole. And for me, when I was thinking about things that may lessen this, it would be more affordable healthcare, greater access to opportunities through outreach and social programs, which would really help lessen this barrier between having a life of well-being and just having a wealthy life. Um, but as I said, limitations to this data and this research is that self-reported data is subject to biases and timing, right? You could have caught the respondent on a day in which they're not doing too well. And so responses such as life satisfaction and happiness may not have been completely accurate. Income was categorical, with the highest level being 25,000, which is fairly low in the grand scheme of the ranges of income in the United States. And another limitation, I didn't control for extraneous variables. The United States is a culturally limited in scope. Limitation is true, but the data also and the research is mainly on the United States, and that's why I want to focus on the culture. So, but do consider this as a limitation in taking this outside to other countries and other different cultural norms. And another limitation is I didn't use panel data, which is time variant data, in which this would measure individuals as they maybe age, and we'll see differences in their life satisfaction, health, and happiness over time. But that is my presentation, and thank you very much for listening. Have a good one.